The tennis world has just outdone itself, and it was one of the most memorable weeks for British tennis. Next-gen players were destroying everyone, and a teenager was on a mission to prove that she's the best player on the planet.
A teenage triumph in tennis paradise. Mira Andreeva is the champion in Indian Wells.
Now, we knew Indian Wells was going to live up to its status as the 5th Grand Slam, but both tours just outdid themselves in the Californian desert. And after we go through the full breakdown of what happened last week, I'm going to be leaving you guys with some really bold Miami Open predictions. Speaking of predictions, as of last year, I had Draper forcing his way into the top 10 early this season because he'd been playing top 10 tennis for a while. I think Draper will break into the top 10 before the second half of the season. Draper will also become the new reference for lefties. But what I didn't get right was the hardcourt Masters 1000 he was going to win this season. Throughout his career, Draper has had question marks about his fitness, but we've seen what a healthy Draper can do. From brushing off Fonseca in the first round, to a win over Brooksby in the following round, to dominating 2 top Americans, Fritz, who he's now beaten in their last 2 meetings, and Shelton, who he outplayed royally in their first ever lefty battle. The signs looked good for Draper, and after he handled Alcaraz in the semis, we knew we were in for a treat in the final. Which, by the way, was the first Masters 1000 final contested between 2 players born in the 2000s. Are we starting to get old? Draper's ability to create those insanely high RPMs on the gritty hard courts at Indian Wells was a major factor at play in the final. He started the match off on the front foot as the high-bouncing forehands kept the Brit in control of the rallies, also allowing him to step into the court with repeated success. With the balls falling outside of Rune's strike zone, the cameras caught Rune complaining to Lars Christensen that the balls were jumping up so high above his shoulders and even his head sometimes. Draper had a clear strategy to attack Rune's forehand, which goes against the grain where we see lefties often aiming for the backhand of their opponent. Rune got broken early on and had little to no success dealing with Draper's forehand. Safe to say the strategy worked. On top of that, Draper was deadly on the serve, with about 58% of them going unreturned. Rune didn't help himself either by playing average rally balls and sometimes short balls right into Draper's strike zone. The first set was over in a hurry, and it was rinse and repeat in the second. An early break for Draper, and the same forehand-to-forehand dynamics at play, with Draper ultimately finding so much height and spin on the return. The frustration of not being able to stop Draper from executing his rallies led to Rune going ultra-aggressive at times, and then just missing even more. He just couldn't break the cycle. About 51% of Draper's forehands were down the line as he eased through the finish line without even facing a break point. Now, it goes without saying that it definitely wasn't the best level we've seen from Rune. He was missing some easy returns, not injecting enough venom into his forehand cross-court to the Draper forehand. Rune also averaged 53 miles per hour on his first serve return, compared to Draper's 68 miles per hour, with an average of 15 miles per hour added to both players' second serve return. Also, as we can see from the stats, Draper was the one with more spin and speed on the forehand as well. All in all, it was safe to say that Rune got overpowered in what was a very one-sided final. I should also mention that Tennis Insights had Draper sitting pretty on top of the leaderboard for forehand quality at Indian Wells. And it left me wondering how much of a problem this is going to be for other top players. Props to Rune though for a great tournament. He was 1 win away from returning to the top 10, and although he'll feel bad about not making his 4th Masters 1000 final more competitive, he'll definitely be proud of his resurgence so far. Rune had only 2 wins post-Australian Open, but he managed to take down 2 top 10 players, Tsitsipas and Medvedev, on his way to the final. He also got the monkey off his back against Griekspoor, which will only add to his confidence. I thought his level was consistent throughout the tournament, but the match against Medvedev stood out the most for me, just because of Rune's composure from the back of the court. He was dialed in from start to finish, and the way that he constructed points, mixed up the shots, and used the backhand slice a lot was textbook how to beat Medvedev. Not playing with the right strategy and purpose is something that's been pointed out quite a number of times about Rune's game. But judging from the performance last week, it's clear that Rune has been paying more attention to that area. He said he wanted to be more aggressive against Draper in the final, and he'll definitely look to do that moving forward. If his fitness holds up like it did in the desert, I don't see anything stopping him from making another big splash. Although we saw a much improved Medvedev last week, there's still some work to be done. More and more players are clearly discovering ways to break the defensive wall he brings. Knowing that he doesn't have the ability to blast players off the court at will, Medvedev must get his hold percentage back to the level it was like 3 or 4 years ago. And guys, even though we're happy it seems like he's gotten rid of the double fault problem, making only half of his first serves was never going to cut it against Rune. It's crazy to think that Medvedev, at 29 years old, could have become the youngest man ever to win all 6 Hardcourt Masters 1000s. Indian Wells is the only missing piece, and judging from how well he thrives under the conditions despite hating it so much, I think Medvedev is going to get it done at some point. I was also thrilled by the fact that we saw Medvedev celebrating wildly after his win over Arthur Fils. It clearly meant a lot to him, and it shows that he still has a lot of competitive fire in him. But what about Alcaraz? Draper ended the Spaniard's quest for a three-peat in the desert, and probably the idea of Alcaraz buying a house in Indian Wells. Unplayable under these conditions, and with 16 consecutive wins at the tournament, Alcaraz was only 2 wins away from making history. Now, the match against Draper was strained. The first set was probably one of the worst you'll see from Alcaraz, with only 5 first serves made the entire set. Only 3 of them won, and worse still, only 2 second serve points won. And as bad as the service game was, the return was probably even worse. Alcaraz hit 13 unforced errors to Draper's 2, and somehow found a way to lose points. As expected, he rebounded to give Draper a beating in the second, and just when it looked like we were about to witness video game tennis in the third set, a controversial call from the umpire ruined the show. Early in the third set, Jack Draper contested 2 calls with video review. Carlos hit a shot that Jack got to on 1 bounce, but in the middle of the point, the umpire yelled "not up." Jack then contested the call with video review, which confirmed that he got there in 1 bounce. The umpire asked to replay the point because the "not up" call was technically a hindrance, but Draper argued that Carlos was nowhere near the ball and that he would have won the point anyways. He contested with video review once again, and the umpire said the "not up" call came late and that the point was awarded to Draper. Fans then questioned Draper's sportsmanship and fair play, and also made reference to the Felix Auger-Aliassime incident. Let me say this, no one wants to see these kinds of situations happen. Fans argued that the call completely killed the momentum for Carlos. Look, at the end of the day, all I take from this is that the officials just have to do better. The fact that this happened at a Masters 1000 on a center court with 2 players vying for a spot in the final is completely ridiculous. Frankly, it's downright embarrassing for the chair umpire, and honestly, if there's any upshot to it, it's that video review actually does have a place in tennis. Anyways, let me know your thoughts in the comments. After the match, Alcaraz said that the double bounce didn't affect his rhythm and that he was more upset with how he approached the match and handled his nerves. He said that he was more worried about Draper's game than his own game, and as a result, didn't play his best. Looking at the broader trend, I see these losses as just another learning curve for Alcaraz, and he can only get better with these lessons. I know some of you all will be making comparisons with Jannik Sinner's consistency on hard courts and how Sinner doesn't suffer these kinds of losses even on an off day. But let's save that for another day and touch on Joao Fonseca's Phoenix Challenger win. The field was stacked in Arizona, but Fonseca emerged like a phoenix to lift the title in what could have easily passed for an ATP 250, judging from the level we saw. It's Fonseca's 4th title in 4 months, and more importantly, a great response to his disappointing loss to Draper at Indian Wells. Fonseca breezed through Kotov in the first round before battling past Jan-Lennard Struff in 3 sets in the second. Straight sets wins over Hugo Gaston and Nishikori followed before the Brazilian toppled Alexander Bublik in 2 tiebreaks in the final. The final against Bublik was tactical in many ways. Bublik was able to disrupt Fonseca's rhythm from the back of the court with his good old style. I'm talking drop shots, chips, deliberate short balls, and pace, spin, and height variation of all sorts. When on the attack, Bublik was deadly at the net and showed just how good he can be in that department. Oh, and his first serve was like a get-out-of-jail-free card a couple of times when Fonseca tried to break. However, as is often the case, Bublik couldn't quite clean up on the vulnerable second serve and entered double figures for double faults. Fonseca served for the opening set twice at 5-4 and again at 6-5, but Bublik survived on both occasions. The set went into a tiebreak, which Fonseca stole at the death after Bublik failed to execute a serve and volley. It was more of the same in the second set, but Fonseca was the much better player in the important points. Like the first set, the second set also went into a tiebreak. Bublik didn't win a single point as he produced error after error. But shifting the focus back to Fonseca, I was particularly impressed with his problem-solving all tournament. Even when playing with more margins, especially during the earlier rounds, he still found a way to get through opponents. His ability to maintain high levels of concentration and not get frustrated against an unpredictable Bublik in the final was just another measure of how far Fonseca has come in terms of maturity. And by the way, he's now 20-4 on the season across all levels. For Bublik, he'll be looking to build on his momentum going forward. He's struggled to win matches for the better part of the last 52 weeks, and in fact, he was 4-15 post-Wimbledon coming into the Phoenix Challenger. He'd slipped down the rankings, falling outside of the top 80 as well. Luckily, we saw some good stuff from him last week. Switching focus to the women, words cannot fully explain what we saw from Mira Andreeva. But before we get into that, if you're looking to keep up on all the action with the ATP and WTA tours, definitely subscribe to our newsletter, the Courtside Digest. We go into topics that we don't have time to make videos about here on the channel, and it is the spot for opinions and hot takes too. I'll leave the link in the description for you down below, so check it out if you haven't already. Okay, so she was 1-4 against Sabalenka going into the final. And the fact that Sabalenka won their last 2 meetings with relative ease fooled me into thinking this one was going to be a bridge too far for Andreeva. But let me say this, Mira Andreeva doesn't have any limits. She's gone from a more defensive player to finding the perfect balance of defense and attack. There are parts of her game that are nowhere close to her full potential, especially on the serve and with her physicality. But still, Andreeva has been able to beat the best players in the world back-to-back. Her smart decisions on the court, the maturity, and the confidence have been key ingredients in her back-to-back WTA 1000 titles, and with the wealth of experience from her coach Conchita Martinez, the rest of the top WTA players will be having sleepless nights trying to figure out how to beat her. The final against Sabalenka was a masterclass on how to beat a power player. Despite being the far less powerful player, Andreeva was hanging in during the baseline exchanges and then using her soft touch to end points. But for all her variety, Andreeva couldn't tame the tiger in Sabalenka. The first set was over in a hurry as Sabalenka blew her off the court. It looked like it was going to be another one-sided encounter. However, Andreeva hung in there and kept forcing Sabalenka to hit that extra shot. The reward for her persistence was an early break in the second set after a failed attempt on the previous 7 occasions. Andreeva was also a staggering 0-for-18 on break points against Sabalenka on the season prior to the early break. Sabalenka didn't make it easy for Andreeva though. She was throwing everything at her. Andreeva survived this break point in the 6th game of the second set thanks to some insane ball tracking.
No way.
She then managed to hold firm before going on to level the scores. Andreeva then took the game to Sabalenka in the 3rd set, breaking the number 1 to love to go out to an early lead. After Sabalenka looked primed to mount a comeback though by breaking back to 1-all, Andreeva sealed another break and consolidated to go out to lead 3-1. She then protected her lead through the tape to earn her first career win over a reigning world number 1. At only 17 years old, Andreeva is now the youngest player to defeat the world number 1 and number 2 in a single WTA event since 16-year-old Tracy Austin in 1979. Oh, and boy did she have to do it the Madison Keys route. She's also the youngest to win back-to-back WTA 1000 since Martina Hingis in 1997. Oh, and I almost forgot to mention, no woman has won more matches than Andreeva this year. The Russian is currently on a 12-match winning streak, and based on popular demand, I'm gonna be dropping a deep dive about her in the coming days. Andreeva ended Swiatek's 10-match winning streak in Indian Wells, beating the world number 2 for the 2nd consecutive time. Even before the match was over, we saw a frustrated Iga Swiatek create a controversial scene, which we're gonna talk about later on in the video. Swiatek was the defending champion and had won 20 consecutive sets at Indian Wells before running into Mira.
She's done it again. Becomes just the 3rd player to beat Iga Swiatek in the Californian desert.
It's yet another reality check for Iga, who's losing quite some grip on her dominance. Looks like she'll be needing some major reset because it feels like there's this unhealthy pressure building up in her, and even though she's been one of the most disciplined players on tour, she's so hard on herself. Everything looked good when she was winning, but now that she hasn't won a title in over 8 months, it seems like Iga is feeling the pressure. Meanwhile, Sabalenka will be feeling like she's losing too many big titles for her liking. She didn't drop any set coming into the final and was crushing the ball all week. The hardcourt queen couldn't get over the line this time, but she did get her revenge against Madison Keys in the semis. Maddie was on a 16-match win streak, but Sabalenka damn near opened up a bakery on Maddie with bagels and breadsticks on the menu. A 6-0, 6-1 scoreline wasn't just revenge anymore. It looked like it had become personal, and you could tell that Sabalenka is still pissed that she lost that Australian Open final. Still, I thought it was a great tournament from Keys considering the time off she took after her title win in Melbourne. I still have her as a favorite for the Miami Open title, but we'll talk more about that in the Miami Open predictions later on in the video. But now back to the heated moment we saw last week from Iga. Here's what happened.
This was what the crowd were booing in the previous game. Look at Swiatek here, hit the ball right back at the ball kid.
Basically, the ball kid found himself on the receiving end of some transfer of aggression from Iga during her semifinal loss to Andreeva. Others say that these emotions were aimed at Iga's box and not directed at the ball kid specifically. As expected, tennis fans called Iga out for her actions because the ball kid could have been hit. And while this is something tennis players do all the time, it's still not cool. But at the same time, it's easy to see why Iga was upset. She's been making deep runs, but now sometimes struggles to get past the strongest players. Seeing that she was on her way to back-to-back losses to Mira Andreeva, you could totally understand the frustration. More so, she's lost the #1 ranking for a while now, and her psychological struggles following her 1-month suspension from tennis seem to have been worse than we thought. After seeing the massive backlash from fans because of her actions, Iga was forced to put up a really long post detailing everything she's been through lately. Obviously, we can't read everything because it was almost a dozen pages long. But long story short, she explained that it wasn't her intention to hit the ball kid and that she was just taking out her frustration on the ball. She also stated that she apologized to the ball boy and acknowledged her mistake before going on to mention that other tennis players throw tantrums but don't get the same heat she's gotten for her actions. She also went in depth on how the positive doping tests affected her psychologically and also her bid for the #1 ranking before going on to reflect on the process she's made on and off the court. Iga then said that she had a problem with people calling her a robot for not expressing her emotions, and the same people calling her immature for showing her frustrations. If I was in Iga's shoes, I'd totally feel like I was in between a rock and a hard place. On the one hand, you have people calling her unmarketable and unemotional because she doesn't show her emotions on the court, and on the other hand, when she does have an outburst, she's perceived as immature. It's definitely a bit of a double standard, especially when you look at the behavior of some other players that I'm not going to name right now. As far as the apology and explanation go, I definitely thought it was a little bit unnecessary, considering again there are some players out there who have done far worse than Iga and not put in a fraction of the effort for any kind of apology. Let me tell you, when I was a ball boy at the US Open, I was sometimes on the receiving end of some not nice actions from the players, but you have to understand that in the heat of the moment and these players are competing for the salaries that they depend on to live their lives, they're just human at the end of the day. But what do you guys make of Iga's blow up on the court and her subsequent apology? Was it overkill or was it the right thing to do? Definitely let me know your thoughts in the comments. As far as ranking updates go, we have a totally different outlook. Djokovic moves up to #5 despite an early loss in the desert, while Medvedev falls to #8 after failing to defend his finalist points. Draper makes his top 10 debut at #7, while Alex de Minaur slips out of the top 10. Griekspoor moves up 9 spots to #34 after reaching the quarterfinals, while Fonseca soars up to #60 after winning the Phoenix Challenger. I'll give you guys another chance to make your predictions for Fonseca's year-end finish in the comments. Top 30? Top 40? Let me know your opinion. Nishikori is up 12 spots to #64. On the women's side, Andreeva moves 5 spots up to #6 following her title win, while Emma Navarro drops to #10. Belinda Bencic goes 13 spots up to #45 after reaching the quarterfinals at Indian Wells. Unfortunately for Maria Sakkari, the freefall continues and she now finds herself down 22 spots and outside the top 50 after failing to defend her finalist points from last year's Indian Wells. Sonata Kartal goes up 20 spots to #63, while Yuan Yue now finds herself on the verge of falling outside the top 100. Plus, the race to the finals is starting to heat up on both tours, and here's what the top 10 looks like at the moment. Okay, so looking at the first quarter, we have our seeds Zverev, Draper, Rune, Tiafoe, Fils, Mahach, Popyrin, and Pericard. Now, Jannik Sinner has served like half of his time, and Zverev and Alcaraz are literally further away in pursuit of the #1 ranking. Zverev has been in pretty poor form lately. He's on a collision course with Pericard, whose serve on the faster courts might bother him, and at the end of the day, I think that Zverev is at risk of an upset from somebody like a Pericard or a Mahach, who's also been playing out of his mind lately. Even if Zverev is able to survive, say, a matchup with Pericard, which I'm not sure he'll do, I just don't see him making it out of the quarter, especially with Draper and Rune also there poised to make a run. Speaking of Rune, he got a bad draw, with possible matchups early on with Opelka and Eubanks. Machac is in the third, and a rematch with Draper could be in the fourth round. That would then lead into Zverev in the quarters, Fritz in the semis, and Alcaraz in the final. Safe to say that the odds are pretty stacked against him. I would also love to see Tiafoe break out of his slump. He comes into Miami as the 16th seed, has a first round bye, and isn't going to really be tested until he would hypothetically face Arthur Fils in the third round. Now, just given both of their current trajectories, I'd probably go with Fils over Tiafoe, but if Tiafoe can make it through that match, he'll definitely find at least a little bit of that confidence he's been looking for. Tomas Machac retired in the second round at Indian Wells, but he has been in pretty good form lately. He's probably my sneaky pick to log an upset or two, but I just don't think he's going to make it out of the quarter overall. Now, Jack Draper doesn't have any points to defend in Miami. Can he push for a top 5 spot with a deep run, or will the fatigue from Indian Wells stop him? After these long tournaments and a lot of time spent on court, we typically see a bit of a hangover from players when they go to Miami. Now, Draper has struggled with his fitness in the past, but it's something that he's been working on, and honestly, I like the matchup against him and Zverev. Looking at the second quarter, we have Taylor Fritz, Andrei Rublev, Alex de Minaur, Shelton, Humbert, Hurkacz, Shapo, and Berrettini. Starting with Fritz, he hasn't been in good form lately. He has a tricky draw with a potential match against Sonego in the second round and Shapo in the third. I would say between both of those matches, his chances of getting upset are actually pretty high, especially against Shapo, who's also a tough matchup for him. Speaking of talented lefties, Shelton's also in the mix. I like him in a possible third-round clash with Hurkacz, and even though both of them are big servers, I think Shelton's game is just a little bit more well-rounded at this point. Hurkacz has won Miami before, but has been disappointing in his last 2 tournaments. Fonseca versus Lerner Tien will be the battle of the next gen, and it's going to be an early popcorn match in this round. I just love their contrasting styles. Yes, I've mentioned it before, Fonseca gets way more hype with the big ground strokes and explosiveness, and Tien is a little bit quieter, more with the Medvedev-like pace absorption and defensive style. I could also see Alex de Minaur making it through if he can make it through his third-round clash against Hugo Humbert. Looking at Djokovic's quarter, he'll be accompanied by Medvedev, Tsitsipas, Musetti, Felix Auger-Aliassime, Korda, Lehechka, and Mickelson as the other seeds. Djokovic is playing in Miami for the first time since 2019, which is crazy to say, and he'll be eager to find his winning form after the shock defeat against Bodek at Indian Wells. I hate to bet against Djokovic at this point, and he could have an interesting matchup against his fellow Serb Hamad Medjedovic in round 2. If he doesn't suffer some shock defeat, he's my obvious pick to make it through the quarter, but do we really have the confidence to make those types of picks anymore? Him against Medvedev could be an interesting battle to see who ultimately makes it through. Speaking of Medvedev, the Russian could face off against Stefanos Tsitsipas in the 4th round. Who do you think is going to win that one? I think with the faster courts, I gotta go with Medvedev. He's playing out of his mind, his pace absorption is there, and Tsitsipas, even with the new frame, I don't think is gonna really be able to trouble him. Gael Monfils is also in this section of the draw. The dude is like 60, but still absolutely balling. I think this corner of the draw is super interesting because I love the upset potential, especially with guys like Felix Auger-Aliassime and Mickelson in the mix too. Novak as the top seed in this quarter isn't really giving me a whole lot of confidence at this point, so that's why I'm going to take Daniil Medvedev to make it all the way through here. In the final quarter, we have Carlos Alcaraz, Casper Ruud, Tommy Paul, Dimitrov, Khachanov, Cerundolo, Tabilo, and Nakashima. At this point, what should we expect from Alcaraz following his loss to Draper? Is he even still the favorite in Miami? Despite being a Miami Open finalist, Ruud has actually been quite inconsistent on hard courts since 2022. He's honestly my pick to get upset here, and I don't really love how he matches up against Tabilo or Cerundolo. Grigor Dimitrov is also in this quarter of the draw, and he actually beat Carlos at the event last year. Will he show up again? I don't know if he makes it through Khachanov in the 3rd round, but if he does, and he does get on that collision course with Carlos Alcaraz, I just don't have him changing anything or flipping the script against Alcaraz, especially given that he was actually embarrassed by Carlos at Indian Wells last week. I almost forgot to mention that Nick Kyrgios is also in this quarter, and he's using his protected ranking despite his wrist issues. I don't really know what he's doing at this point, honestly, just because these wrist issues are so hard to battle back from, and if he's not resting, he's just not going to get better. I'd honestly be shocked to see him make any kind of a run in Miami. Looking at quarter 1 versus quarter 2, I'm taking an all-lefty matchup, Jack Draper against Ben Shelton, and the question of who makes it out is just going to be whose fitness is holding up better. Looking at quarters 3 and 4, I have the matchup being Carlos Alcaraz against Daniil Medvedev, and guys, Alcaraz owns the head-to-head 6-2, and I find it just hard to bet against him at this point. He's my pick to make it through here. Draper did edge Shelton in the quarterfinals at Indian Wells, but I have Ben getting his revenge this time. So with that said, my crazy pick to win it all, I'm gonna go Ben Shelton. I like his game, and even though he hasn't gotten off the schneid and beaten Alcaraz yet, I think this could be his opportunity. Looking at the women's side, can 17-year-old Mira Andreeva, who's literally the best player on the WTA Tour right now, become the youngest woman to complete the Sunshine Double? She's on a 12-match winning streak, by the way, and has won back-to-back 1000s. Make it 3 in a row? Aryna Sabalenka is the hardcourt queen, and she's looking for her first Miami Open title. She was the Indian Wells runner-up last week, but in 6 appearances in Miami, she's never made it past the quarterfinals. Iga Swiatek won the Sunshine Double in 2022, joining these other women to achieve the incredibly rare feat. Steffi Graf in 1994 and 96, Kim Clijsters in 2005, and Victoria Azarenka in 2016. I like the chances of the American women, and I feel like they just always do well in Miami. Speaking of American women, Danielle Collins is the defending champ, and she won her first WTA 1000 title last year, which kickstarted a 15-match win streak. I like Jessica Pegula after the title run in Austin, which I got to see firsthand, and also Madison Keys is rested and will be looking to make a run. In the final, it'll be a toss-up, but I'm taking Pegula here on her home court. Last week in tennis was one for the history books, but with the Miami Open underway, we're in for some epic matches for sure. I'll actually be out there doing some video, so if you see me around the grounds, definitely come and say hi. If you enjoyed this video and you love what we're doing here at Courtside Tennis, be sure to like and subscribe, and I'll see you around the courts in Miami.